Welcome to this week's episode of Thinking Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Wu, with my co-host, Michael Brandt. And let's dive into it. I'm really excited to have Geoff Browning on with us this week. And in terms of human performance, I think ultra runners, folks that run, that really look at a marathon as almost a warm-up. So 50, 100-mile runs as some of the most interesting specimens of human performance. And we have one of the premier ultra runners with us today. Please introduce yourself.
Glad to be on the show. Geoff Browning, ultra runner, athlete, coach, and I'm getting up there in age, 45 years old, dad of 3 kids. Live in Bend, Oregon.
Yeah, awesome. I think one thing that I've come to see as a pattern, I'm curious what your perspective is on this, is that a lot of ultra marathoners, or at least a few handful that I've spoken to, they all have pretty extreme habits. And I think a couple that come to mind have started off with drug addiction and approached running as a way to channel that addiction to something positive and meaningful. I'm curious, how does one go from, hey, running 25 miles is not enough, I want to run 100 miles. Like, what is your story getting into the ultra marathon space?
I realized that when I wanted to run this 100, I was like, well, I got to run. If I'm going to run 100, I got to run a marathon. Then I got to run a 50K, and then I've got to I found out that you had to get in a lottery, and there was you had to qualify with a 50-mile race back then. Now it's a 100K race, right. But it was a year and a half out before I could even get to the start line, and it wasn't and it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because I'm very impatient, and so just by nature, I wanted to just go do it, right? Once I had it in my head, I was like, I don't want to wait, but it was the best thing that ever happened because that meant I had to prepare for 18 months. Right. And run like a couple 50Ks and deal with a couple injuries, overuse injuries, and learning to train for that distance, coming from a cycling background. And then, so I hadn't pounded a ton, I'd always been a runner. I've always run my dog for 20, 30 minutes, 3 days a week or 4 days a week or that kind of stuff, and then a lot of cycling. So that kind of how I that whole build up to that 100-miler that I ran in 2002. I ran Western States in 2002. I ran like 3 50Ks, a 50-miler, and a 100K before I even showed up at the start line. And that set me up for success in a 100-miler because I had experience. I had probably 4 or 5 races under my belt and a lot of big training days in the mountains leading up to that. Wow.
So basically it seems like within 18 months, you basically went from being like a casual jogger, right? If you're just running your dog 20, 30 minutes 3 times a week, that's just like walking a dog type of but I guess you were athletic through cycling, etc. But from a running perspective, you went from level 1 casual to like one of the most extreme athletes. So for the first few races, you had hit the 100-mile mark. When did it become, hey, it's not just a bucket list item, I'm going to make a career, I'm going to be a competitive 100-miler ultramarathoner?
It came kind of like slowly because in that whole time I started to get connected to like the ultra running community, and that's what most people are attracted to when you become an ultra runner. It's this like little tribe.
Yeah, it's a rare club.
And so it's kind of this exclusive little like nomadic tribe that goes around to all these cool mountain towns and does races in the mountains, and like everybody's connected and says, oh, they like to be in the running dirt and running primal, and so like I was attracted to that deep, rich community that was part of it, and it kept me kind of like doing these races. And then when I finally like showed up to the start line at Western States 100 in 2002, it kind of became like I was scared to do 100 miles, but after I did it, by the time I finished, I was like, oh, that really hurt, painful, but I knew immediately it was such a big thing that I would do it again.
Okay.
So what were you doing every day? Like you were just running 20, 30 miles every morning?
No, it's most ultra running is a lot like marathon training. So it's like maintenance runs during the week and then one long run a week.
Okay.
But you're just doing it on like more specific mountain terrain instead of like running roads. So a lot more elevation. You might be out longer. And then every once in a while you're doing back-to-backs and that kind of thing. But I also was running, coming from a cycling background, I was running maybe 4 days a week. And then I was cross-training on my bike.
Right.
And I found if I went over 4 days a week, I'd break down and I'd get injured.
Yeah.
So, I had not been besides a little bit of running and all the sports in high school of running, I hadn't really been pounding, at least in my 20s. I've been on a bike mostly. So non-weight bearing.
Yep.
So there's an adaptation phase that has to happen when you're coming from no pounding to pounding. And cycling also develops a little bit of a muscle imbalance when it comes to running. You tend to really overwork your upper quads and your hamstrings in a cycling motion of pulling on. Once you learn to spin really well and actually be pulling on the backstroke of the
right.
bike. So I had to work that out, and it didn't. That 03 and 04 were really frustrating. I was able to race in 04, and I got fifth at Wasatch 100, and I was kind of still I realized that hundreds were kind of the longer it got, the better I got. And so I realized that was kind of the distance, was the longer distances for me. So I wanted to focus on those, but I was having trouble getting injured every time I tried to get up and build up to one of those. So I worked with a strength training coach. That's when I brought.
What were some of the tools and ways that you had of measuring? You have this intuition around how your body is composed for cycling, but it's not optimal for running. What were you using any tools, or what were you working on with your trainers to have just that awareness of your physiology?
It was a synergy of I changed my diet, which made me healthier and build muscle mass back, and then I strength trained like crazy, and then I also got a hold of chi running. And so just working on running, I started looking at running form. I started thinking about okay, I'm getting injured a lot. And it was knee tracking and IT band syndrome and all these other things. And I was like, okay, what's going on? I started looking at the biomechanics of running and thinking about it from a physiological standpoint. And we look at every other sport, and it's cycling or mountain biking or skiing or whatever it is, Nordic skiing. It's all technique based, right? You learn how to do that sport. There's a technique to it, and you fine tune that technique and get better at it. Whereas most people just go run, right? They step out the door, they put on shoes. It's very approachable. That's what's cool about it. But you just go out the door, and you don't really think about the proper way to run.
So you self-studied a lot of
right.
the proper running techniques, because I think
and it's really changed in the last 5-6 years. People are talking about good form running. There's all these little clinics that
right.
running stores put on, but back then, the only thing I could find was chi running, and I found this thing, and I was like, okay. I worked on cadence. I worked on paw back and pawing your foot and heel back and kind of running circles like you would on a bike and
right.
and all those little things, and leaning from your ankles and arm swing. And I started really working on those and counting steps and cadence all through 05. And the strength training kind of came together, and that messed with. I figured out too, with this strength training coach, he was like, okay, proper muscle balance is your quad to hamstring ratio. This is getting geeky, but
right.
quad to hamstring ratio of strength should be 150% quad strength so a 1.5 to 1
right.
or ratio of strength to quad imbalance. And I had the opposite. I was 1.5 times stronger in my hamstrings than my quads because you get really strong in your upper quad cycling, but your vastus medialis and the muscle that's right above your kneecap, those muscles are less worked compared to the upper quad, and your hamstrings are overworked from the pulling. So
right. Interesting. So the pulling, for cycling, pulling is actually stronger. So you pull.
Well, you learn to pull on the backstroke
right.
and bring it back around.
Right.
Right. So it's all about being light in your shoes
right.
and being cycling or spinning circles, but you also are pushing on the upstroke, especially on the top, back 1/3 top of the stroke.
Right.
As you come over the top, you should be engaging your quad. Right. Center quad and upper quad. But it really doesn't work the vastus medialis a lot, and that's the muscle that's responsible for proper knee tracking. So when you're running, because I was primarily a cyclist for a good decade before I got into ultra running, I created muscle imbalances, and then I spent that whole year or off season working on that muscle imbalance.
Well, it was not really muscle imbalance. You were optimizing for a specific use case, and you were basically shifting use cases. So
exactly.
Let's re-optimize my physiology. Interesting.
Totally.
And I think And I think, that was around the same time when Born to Run became a popular book, right? I think that's the book that talked about
that. Yeah.
Right. So I think you were a little bit
after that?
Yeah, I think I started reading that book like '07, or I believe. Or I read that
book.
Yeah,
'07, '08. So that was like 2 or 3 years after that.
So they're a little bit ahead of the curve, but for folks that don't know what we're talking about here, that was the book with the barefoot running, the tribes in
the Tarahumara
right.
in the Copper Canyons of Mexico.
Right, doing like 100, 200-mile runs, and I think it just brought ultra running, more into the public forefront. Is that? Would you say that's probably true in sense of like public perceptions?
That really it brought ultra running into the forefront because it was a bestseller and people were talking. And that's about the time when like barefoot running was like getting popular, and we saw this the barefoot movement was made the biggest shift in running footwear design that we've seen in 30 years of footwear design, right? In running shoes. So it really shifted the bell curve, over to one side, and then it kind of got extreme for a while, and then it kind of, typical where the pendulum swings way far to one side, and then it comes back to center.
We're seeing a lot less shoe these days. Just a lot less padding, a lot more just. Well,
we're seeing less heel lift, which that's the thing that came out of the barefoot moment that was really cool, is like talking about proper foot function. So like not locking up the arch and big toe. So seeing a straighter line on the arch and big toe in the design of shoes, and a little wider toe boxes instead of the narrow kind of Italian dress shoe style of running shoe.
Well, because it gives some cushioning, like when your toes spread out like that. It gives some impact. It catches some of the impact, as opposed to when they're together, you have less shock absorption, right?
Well, what people don't understand when you're a runner, your big toe, it naturally, just human physiology, our big toe is our first point of contact to tell everything up the chain what to do. So when the big toe touches the ground, it says arch engage, and it stabilizes the foot. That goes up into the Achilles, goes up into the calf, all the way up the chain, and all the way to the brain, and says, I need you to not collapse. I need you to land softly. I need you to push off here. So like it's the first point of contact, and it gives the signals. And if you shut off that big toe in a triangle-shaped foot box, if you look at the front half of your foot, it's basically a square, or a rectangle. And we're taught at an early age to not like a triangle, a square doesn't fit in a triangle, right? So why are we trying to put a square foot in a triangle shoe?
Yeah, it makes total sense. I'm curious, in parallel, it sounds like your diet and your approach to nutrition has definitely evolved over the years as you become a more and more of an accomplished athlete. Walk us through the thinking behind, it seemed like the vegetarianism didn't necessarily start off from a performance perspective, but I think nowadays, you're a leading proponent around low carb, high fat, ketogenic diets for endurance sports, and that's something that's very interesting to us as biohackers looking at sort of improved cognitive function and endurance function.
Yeah, I think that evolution just kind of came naturally, and we're having this science, this fat science is kind of emerging, right? In the last 10, 15 years, we're really starting to understand, and the propaganda of the diet heart hypothesis is kind of going away. People are in the know that the science is a house of cards. We have a reproducibility problem in nutritional science with all those dietary guidelines.
Yeah, we were talking to Gary Taubes a few weeks ago. I mean, he definitely.
I listened to that podcast.
Yeah, no, that was good. That was a good conversation.
Yeah, and so that if you understand that the politics behind it, then you understand that like there's no reason to fear fat, and that becomes, this recent change is just, for me personally, came from like out of like I was exploring, and my wife has always been a little hypoglycemic symptoms. So too many carbs, especially we found over the years, like as we evolved. And tweaked diet and watched what we ate and how certain foods reacted in the system. Like we noticed she was really sensitive to like higher glycemic index foods, especially processed carbohydrates, or like, even potatoes and stuff like that. And if she had pretty heavy carb meals 3 or 4 times in a row, she'd get a migraine. She'd be down for the count, out of it, have to take a nap type of thing. just fully on like catatonic, you know? And so we started realizing that it was food related, and she'd been dealing with this since she was in probably late high school. And she was a gymnast in college on a scholarship. And so there was just this like constant carb intake and constant migraines and constant crashing, and didn't know what it was. And then she had depression issues in her 20s. And so, and all of it was food related. When we look back now, we're like, it's so like,
I mean, it's one of the main inputs into our body, right? Food.
Yeah. And understanding what it does to insulin now, and, you know, and understanding she's probably a little insulin resistant.
Did you do glucose monitoring? You do like blood glucose monitoring or continuous glucose monitoring implants, anything like that?
No, we do ketone monitoring mainly. It's just a breathalyzer. That's the only thing. She realized, she figures out like this has been the best diet for her, you know, doing something of a primal blueprint, paleo bulletproof style diet. She stays a little more ketogenic than I do. I go cyclically ketogenic. So initially to get the fat adaptation and to really optimize your fat metabolism for endurance, and burn onboard fat and open up that metabolic pathway, you know, we have to restrict carbs to like ketogenic style for a good 4 weeks to 5 weeks, and then cyclically around like easier workouts, not working out as hard, and then strategically sneak in carbs around harder workouts. So my biohack is kind of the Vespa OFM protocol, that optimized fat metabolism protocol of strategic carbs around hard effort. Still using simple carbs on long run days, still using simple carbs on race day, but just after you've gone through adaptation phase, you're burning a certain percentage of your caloric needs from onboard fat because you've opened up that metabolic pathway.
Right.
So the idea is you're metabolically flexible. I have a carb pathway I can burn if I need to go harder, and I have a fat one that I'm burning as a baseline. You're just shifting that VO2 max out to be able to burn fat at a higher VO2 max when you've fat adapted, and then you have a dual fuel source.
Right.
So you're bonk proof, and that's the beauty of it. Bonk proof. And that's been the craziest thing about this diet. You still have an Achilles heel of like dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, if you get low on sodium, that kind of thing, because you're not eating as much per hour. The thing I found too, after adaptation, you really don't have to. My caloric intake per hour in, say, a race, in a 100-mile race, used to be 300 to 500 calories an hour. And that's really hard for your body when it's exercising to break that much calorie down.
Yep.
But otherwise, I'd bonk. I would have bonk symptoms. And
so bonking
and that's
is,
how it's been.
For folks that aren't up to speed on the terminology here, is like hitting the wall. So usually for a non-fat adapted athlete, we have 2,000 kilocalories of glycogen, or stored glucose, stored carbohydrate. And typically when you basically run out of glucose, our bodies are not fat adapted, you crash. So if you are fat adapted, you start being more efficient in burning body fat as a fuel for running. Well,
and what was shown in like Jeff Volek's study and the FASTER study at University of Connecticut a couple years ago, and the FASTER study was to give listeners kind of a background, was a study on 20 male elite endurance athletes that were either Ironman triathletes or ultra runners. They were matched in two groups. One cohort was 10 runners, were basically around a 60 to 70% carbohydrate diet, a pretty standard endurance diet in today's athlete. And then there were 10 cohorts that were keto adapted. So they had been doing the fat adaptation diet, like in their everyday diet, they've been eating a high fat, low carb diet. About 70 to 80% of their caloric intake was fat.
Right.
And most of them have been doing it for at least 6 months. Some had been doing it up to 5 years. So those two groups,
that's super hard to maintain. Yeah.
What that?
80%, like a real ketogenic diet. I think like one misnomer is that people think it's like easy to eat keto. It's like if you're not like literally eating like sticks of butter or just legit trying to pursue fat, it's very hard to get 80% fat calories. Not if you're just doing vegetables. If you're eating from a primal list of foods, like and you're concentrating on, I'd actually kind of respectfully disagree a little bit. Interesting.
Because if you get used to just saying, okay, I'm eating vegetables as my baseline, that's my carbohydrates, right?
Okay.
And then I'm concentrating on animal fat meat. So like fatty cuts of meat, dark meat and chicken,
right.
Skin on chicken, drippings, making
right.
sure the white meat's in the drippings, right? Like thinking about chuck roast and ribeyes and T-bones and not like the lean cuts.
Right.
So you're getting a good fat profile, because most people don't understand
you
that.
you start getting the risk of going overweight on protein, because protein will break down into amino acids, and through neoglucogenesis will turn into carbs again. So I think,
but that's why you want to go for the fatty cuts, because, for instance, a T-bone or a ribeye is
one of the fattier
40% fat, and that fat profile is basically about half monounsaturated fat and saturated fat. So having that 40%, when you eat an 8-ounce steak, right, then
3.2 ounces theoretically would be fat. Sure.
Fat.
Yeah.
Right. So you're really only eating 5 ounces of steak.
Right.
Of actual protein. So I think that's where, like, a lot of people make some mistakes when they first do a ketogenic diet, is they stay eating lean meat because they still
eat too
have
much protein. They're like, I need to eat like
they still
whey
have
protein.
the fat paradigm in their head, right? And you can't be afraid of fat anymore. And there's been over 100 studies now that have kind of discounted the whole diet heart hypothesis in recent times, and we don't have to be scared of saturated fat anymore.
Yeah. So I don't want to interrupt there with I'm curious to hear the results of that trial with the keto adapted athletes versus the typical Western carb heavy diet. So what happened for that trial?
So basically they did, like, muscle biopsies, cheek biopsies, blood work, measured their VO2 max. They measured these guys up so they were really close in height, weight, body weight, VO2 max, all those kind of things in the two groups. And then they did like a VO2 max test. They did a 3-hour fasted treadmill run. They basically poked and prodded these guys for 4 or 5 days,
right,
in the lab, and took fecal testing, matter
microbiome
testing, all kinds of stuff, just to see everything. So what they basically found was, after no one had ever been at this point, there had been no study done on athletes that had changed their diet for more than 14 days.
Yeah.
The average was like 7 to 14 days, no more than 14 days. What we understand now in the science is, like, just to even open up the metabolic pathway takes 21 days.
Yep.
Right? To really open it up. And it really gets more efficient at like 8 to 12 weeks, and even more longer you do it.
Absolutely. I think that's one thing that is that you're really shifting your biotechnology. So there's your body's either optimizing for glycolysis, processing carbs, or ketosis, processing fat into ketones. And I think, yes, as you said, it really does take your body, up to a month, 6 weeks to really start shifting the core, metabolism to function better and optimize for certain metabolic substrates. Yeah.
Absolutely. So in this test, this was the first time they'd ever done it on very keto adapted athletes that have been doing it a long time and have already gone through full adaptation.
Right.
And so in the measurement, they found, like, the highest in the carb group. So in the high carb group, the average was, I don't know, I can't remember exactly the average, but it was somewhere in like 0.5, 0.7, maybe 0.5 grams per minute of burning fat. Pretty good fat adapted, right? Most people are under a 0.5, mm-hmm. and the highest measure was maybe about 1 gram per minute. But in the fat adapted, keto adapted group, the most interesting thing was it was the lowest measured per minute of burning fat was higher than the highest in the high carb group.
Right.
So it was over 1 gram per minute, and the highest measure was 1.8 grams per minute. Before that, the science really said 1 gram, 1.1 grams per minute is the highest a human can achieve.
In terms of burning fat
in terms of burning fat per minute.
Okay.
So that's where it was a full paradigm shift. And they also found that VO2 max shifts too. So what our understanding previously in testing was like 65% was about the max where you shifted to burning full-on sugar, glycogen, what you're talking about, that 2,000 calories that we have stored. Like, it shifts to burning sugar after 65% of VO2 max. Yep. What they found in this is the carb group was somewhere in around 55-60% when they shifted to burning carbs, and primarily carbs. But the fat-adapted group was in the mid-70s%. The highest was like 82% or something.
Right.
So 81 or 82 of VO2 max. That's like elite marathon race pace, burning primarily 90-some% onboard fat.
And that's awesome, right? And that's so key, because you have 100 times more calories stored in fat. Like if you're going to do this kind of endurance ultra marathon running, you got to be fat adapted then.
Well, it makes sense because, right, we have 2,000 calories on board, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours worth of effort of glycogen to burn before we have to start bringing in exogenous calories, right? Some kind of carbohydrate to keep us going and keep the brain from shutting down because the brain needs glucose. So
or ketones, but if you're not fat adapted,
ketones. If you're not fat adapted, you're not giving it ketones. Right. So a 7% body fat elite athlete has 40,000 onboard fat calories to tap into versus 2,000 of sugar. Right. So
and even 7% is insanely lean. Like the average American, I think, had 300,000 fat calories on board. So you literally
on board, man. So we have plenty of calories.
Yeah.
And so once you can tap into that with the keto adaptation, where the biohack comes is this is where optimized fat metabolism comes in. This is where we start using strategic carbohydrates, dripping simple carbohydrates on an hourly basis like an IV drip to tell the brain it's okay. It's still burning ketones, but it also has a little bit of glucose drip to keep that body just saying, I'm good, everything's cool. But then you don't have any GI stress because you're not throwing 300 to 500 calories an hour at it.
So I'm curious, when you're running, what VO2 max are you hitting, right? Because I think there is an interesting, nuance here is that when you're doing like 100% VO2 max, you have to be burning glucose. Like for anaerobic, like sprints and lifts, you need glucose there. So this like fat adaptation or ketones is not like this magic thing that makes you Superman. It has to be in very nuanced cases. So I'm curious, have you measured, what zone do you try to stay in your aerobic threshold when you're doing 100 milers?
I'm pretty much trying to stay like in the maffetone, somewhere in the maffetone or modified maffetone method, which is 180 minus your age.
Okay.
If you've been training for a long time, you can add plus 5 or 10, depending on how long you've been doing. So I find that if I stay in kind of that aerobic, right around that aerobic ceiling, I can go above that aerobic ceiling for a little while here and there into interval, like 20, 30-minute sessions, and then come back down and be okay. I found I can do it more after fat adaptation. I can stay in that higher zone. I can go up to a higher VO2 max longer.
Right, because theoretically your aerobic threshold has went up because you're more fat adapted.
And your weight goes down because, especially if you're a 45-year-old runner and who's eating a high carb diet, I'd say, I don't know, just by my own visual data of being at races, the average masters runner has a little spare tire.
Wow.
And even if they're an elite runner, like when I was running constantly, I still had a little bit around the middle, and that wouldn't quite go away. If you looked at me with my shirt off, everybody'd be like, oh, he's in really good shape. But knowing the body, it's like, I got a little extra there, and it was all around in that core section where you don't want to have it, right? It's where they say it's the most unhealthy in a male is through like the top of your quads to like the bottom of your chest. And so just a little, and I found that it was harder and harder to get to race weight in every season as I got older. So on this, it's just like I dropped 8 pounds. And my strength to weight ratio goes way up. And when you're an elite athlete and you can drop 8 pounds, your strength to weight ratio goes way up.
Like
that means
5 to 10%. Yeah, it's 5 to 10%. That's a big amount of weight. It doesn't sound like a lot for normal people, but if you're like 150 pounds optimized,
try strapping a 4-pound like sandbag onto each foot and going for a jog.
Exactly. So I think the beauty of it is that it's easy to stay in race weight. Your VO2 max should go up on this diet, on this lifestyle change. And the other thing that's probably the most, I know we're getting off track because we're not really talking about faster study anymore, but the beauty of this thing is its recovery changes so much. And especially when you're a master's runner, plus 40, 40 plus, like I am, that's what you notice the most is you don't recover from the efforts you used to.
Yep. Yeah, there's very interesting data with elevated ketone levels being, basically lowering inflammation markers versus glucose. So a lot of emerging data around how ketones are, essentially what we're talking about. Like when you're burning ketones, you don't generate lactic acid, where if you're anaerobically processing glucose, you're generating a bunch of lactic acid. So in terms of recovery, there's a lot of emerging science there. as you're saying.
Yeah, the respiratory quotient on burning fatty acids, burning glucose is pretty interesting because, it's 1-to-1 ratio. If you're burning glucose, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. You burn a unit of oxygen and you kick out a unit of CO2,
Yep.
right? So there's that lactic acid. You get a little more acidic. The system goes a little more tips towards the acidic, and you're trying to get rid of that lactic acid. Whereas if you're burning fats, that fuel source is way more efficient. It's a 1-to-1 on average 0.75 ratio. That means for 1 unit of oxygen, you're only kicking out 0.75 of CO2, which means the theory behind the fat adaptation model is that we're doing less oxidative stress over the long term of the event. I'm taking half the calories I used to in a 100-miler, and I have 2200s, over 100 ultramarathons as a high carb athlete to compare it to, and it's night and day. The recovery is night and day. I can take less than half of what I used to per hour during an event of exogenous carbohydrate.
Right.
So it's really a pretty sweet model because all of a sudden you don't have to carry as much. You don't have GI stress because you're not like pushing down an extra 200 or 300 calories an hour down your gut and asking it to like break it down.
You're talking about exogenous carbohydrates. So we've been looking a lot at exogenous ketones as an interesting intervention for performance enhancement. So what is your experience with like exogenous ketones? Have you looked into that at all as a part of your routine?
I have. I messed around with Keto-OS a little at Western States last year, and I found that I couldn't do the stuff with MCT powder because the fat was too heavy. It comes in too heavy when you're in like a stressful race situation where the body's like, I'm just trying to break food down and get it through the gut wall, right? So and get it to the bloodstream so we can use it. So I found that using it strategically in a few spots was really good because it's, it helps. I found like it helped.
Okay.
That's my only experience with it. I do know that with testing it, this is an interesting thing to throw out there for people who are messing around, who are already keto adapted or on a ketogenic diet and are messing around with exogenous ketones, is that one thing that's interesting is if you're watching your ketone levels and you're seeing if you're in nutritional ketosis, I find that when you do take exogenous ketones, your natural ketone production plummets. So it replaces your natural. So that's one thing out there for me.
There's some subtlety there, yes, because if you have elevated exogenous ketones, then your body's like, hey, we're already deep into ketosis. We don't need to do fat breakdown for more ketones. So it inhibits natural lipolysis and endogenous production. But it's sort of a balance, right? Like for a lot of ketone salts like Keto-OS, you don't elevate your beta hydroxybutyrate levels that much.
Right. But I feel like it has a place as a tool.
Right.
So like, how to use it, I haven't really figured out how to use it yet. Like I think strategically during a race probably, so that way you're getting you are burning ketones already. I'm just wondering, I'd like